Welcome. Welcome to Co-Evolutionary Culturing, composting power over culture from the inside out. Today with Claire Milne and Sarah McFarland. In this episode, Claire and I talk about where starter culture has come from, the road it's taken so far, and how it's renewing itself right now at these spring days at equinox. We talk about the deep structure of starter culture and what we're really up to, which is the shifting of consciousness from human-centered to earth-centered, that we begin to think like an ecosystem rather than the individualistic thought ways that are the power over culture in each of us. And so with our podcast, we invite you into an embodied experience of being Earth, a ritual of dismantling, a remembering ourselves into the web of life, in order to meet these times of collapse and possible renewal with great love in the face of the unknown. Join us for this consciousness-expanding conversation today on Co-Evolutionary Culturing. Hi, everyone. We're really happy to be with you here in this interwebs virtual portal of Zoom, or if you're listening on one of the other platforms to the podcast, we greet you. This is our very, very first inaugural Starter Culture podcast episode, and we're really excited and a little bit nervous and happy to drop in with you today. And my name is Sarah McFarland, and I'm here with Claire Milne, who is the co-founder of Starter Culture. And I'm so excited to be together to just have this time to really introduce starter culture into the world. I know that it's been around for a while, but it feels like this kind of renewal, rebirth moment is, happening at this time of year as the spring is gathering, the sap is flowing, and the buds are, swelling. That there's this rebirth, renewal feeling at starter culture. So, and part of it's this podcast, right? So of what's getting born into the world. I'd love to just invite you to share with me and share with us, because I'm just joining Starter Culture, officially about a month ago now. Yeah, I'd love to invite you to just share with us, who is Starter Culture? Who is this creature that is Starter Culture?
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here having this conversation, and it feels like it is a kind of there's an iteration of rebirth happening in you and others kind of jumping more fully in now. So I kind of feel like whenever I speak of what it is, who it is that starter culture is, there's something of a kind of constant process of iteration and reiteration and emergence. So I'm curious to see what words will come as to what's happening right now. And I love that is how we work, so emergently and honoring of what's been, but, what's now and what's becoming. So how to explain share a little of what starter culture is and where it's come from and what it's becoming. I always find it helpful actually to start with a sharing of kind of its roots, because somehow it kind of gives the most tangible way of understanding the creature that starter culture is. So the roots of starter culture really, or the tangible roots at least, are those that in that there were three co-founders, myself and Eva Schonfeld and Joe Hamilton, who ended up in a conversation or in a meeting together, each of us with about 20 years of experience in working in social and environmental change in a variety of ways, and found ourselves with a shared kind of passion and kind of concern really around how much the inner dimension of the change that we were involved in was neglected, and the absolute cost of that, just looking at these, hundreds of thousands, millions of people so passionate about bringing about change in the world, about being part of co-creating something different that really honors what, our hearts kind of can feel has to be possible. And yet just what an uphill struggle that seems to be, and really landing. And it seems to be so largely because we find it so hard to turn towards this inner dimension that for whatever reasons that I'm sure we will dive into at some point, whether today or another time, gets neglected. And and that's not just within social environmental change, of course, it's within our mainstream culture more generally. So that's how starter culture kind of started out. And then we decided to carry out this kind of what we've called our cups of tea process. And so the cups of tea process was across 14 countries, and we had like over 250 cups of tea conversations to kind of really find out how is it for those social and environmental change practitioners, makers, change makers, how is it to try and integrate an inner dimension? Like, how is that for you? What are the challenges you face in that? What are the needs and the opportunities? And that's, in a way, when we come to what the current iteration of starter culture is, it's so fed by those, some 250 conversations that pointed to many things. But there were two things that they kind of most obviously pointed to that felt like they were the real core, the kind of underbelly of what I guess it is to be integrating this inner dimension into our lives and social environmental change. And one of those was lack of funding, and recognizing how hard it is to get funding to actually give the time and get the support that's needed around integrating this inner dimension to allow our change making to really flourish, and to take it seriously and not just keep skipping over what we all know is problematic. And then the second thread is really just seeing how, in a way, all threads within the conversations ultimately kind of dug deep down into the roots of what we could call power over culture, and the reality that it's this consciousness that we've all been kind of accultured into, that we could call power over culture, that seems to be running the show. And that ultimately, if you look at any given problem, I would suggest we were likely to find power over culture at its heart. And so, in a way, you could say that starter culture is a kind of a collective endeavor, adventure, experiment to shift consciousness beyond power over culture, and to do that within ourselves, and to do that kind of amongst ourselves and other humans, and just as importantly, to be birthing into consciousness that goes well beyond human centrism and recognizes our more than human reality, and that we're not just individuals, that we are inherently part of a wider web of life. So yeah, there's different iterations, but all the paths lead to this dismantling of power over culture, and recognizing that, how much we've internalized it, how much it lives in us, no matter how dedicated we are to transforming oppression and oppressive systems. It has to live inside us because we've been cultured into that. So there's starter culture is dedicated to that inquiry at various levels of scale, individual, group, other than human, of how have we internalized power over culture? How do we dismantle it and then make space thereby for something new to be birthed through us, that isn't from the strategic mind, that is a product of power over culture, but that is a listening deeply from the emptiness to earth streaming, to mystery, to something that mind it couldn't fathom on its own.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm feeling so inspired and so nourished. I'm like, yes, this is why I am with starter culture.
Well, maybe now is a good moment. Like I kind of feel like there hasn't been time in our working together to hear that from you. So if you feel like, I feel like that would be a really beautiful contribution, if you feel to share, what is it that called you into starter culture, other than my loud howl? Right. Come hither. But yeah, I'd love to hear.
Well, essentially exactly that, that exquisite stretch, that holographic stretch between the tender human heart and inner work, and ways of coming more and more to know ourselves and unearth forgotten or oppressed aspects of ourselves, integrate those aspects, remember ourselves as more than human, and in the other than human web of life. And that the stretch, the reach of that into Right. And that in and of itself, that work in and of itself, with if we have that lens, is this shifting of consciousness that could, if we're lucky, birth something new in the future. It's yet to be seen what will happen. We don't know what's up with collapse. And what did Vanessa Andreotti I was just listening to something on YouTube from her about hospicing modernity, where she said, we're facing the death of everything we know and love.
Mm.
And how to stand in that place of horror and loss and grief and beauty and love and say yes to the transforming with.
Mm.
And for me, starter culture is a possible way of being exactly in that place.
Mm.
In that place of we can't do this alone, right? We need to build community to heal the civilization trauma of separation, weaving community together, and including with other than humans, and also doing this work. And for me, that's just it was like a clarion call of what I myself was feeling mystery calling me into the world and into my life and into my work. And starter culture was like, here's a home for that work. Come join us. Yeah. So it just felt like it was ultimately because, the resonance of your howl with mysteries call, of how I'm supposed to show up in the world and the gifts I'm to bring, just felt so resonant that I could do that. I could fulfill mysteries' invitation or call to me within the liberating structure of starter culture, because of its dedication to shifting consciousness. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. It's all. I always find it so expansive to kind of receive other people's relationships with starter culture and what it is that particularly resonates, because somehow it expands starter culture, even though the alignment's already there. It's like, oh yeah, it just got a bit bigger, a bit brighter, a bit bigger. Yeah. And what you just ended with there around the kind of shifting or expanding consciousness, it feels like more and more they're the kind of boots that starter culture is realizing that it's filling. And it's kind of, such deep blessings and gratitude to our elder Joanna Macy, who kind of framed this, just how the piece around shifting consciousness is so, is key to being able to deliver on the other ways of going about change that are, outer focused. And it feels like starter culture's contribution is to really make tangible, what is it? What does this shifting consciousness, this expanding consciousness, what does that look and feel like? And what is it and what is it not? And what are the costs of not attending to it? And what's possible when we do? And yeah, it's almost like it's opening that Pandora's box of ways of expanding consciousness so that we can go beyond that which has created the pickle that we find ourselves in, and really naming without compromise that if we don't do that, if we don't commit ourselves to expanding beyond the consciousness that created the reality we're in now, then we cannot create something different. We can only keep replicating the same mistakes in different form. And I'm sure we all know it through trying to change aspects of ourselves, that unless we get to the real core and the consciousness that's created the problem, maybe it's an addiction or whatever, or a pattern of behavior we don't want to be doing, it just finds its way into another kind of rivulet to have its way with us. And so there's something of that kind of expanding consciousness, shifting consciousness that feels really important. It's interesting, I'm noticing my language here, because for me actually expanding consciousness somehow feels like it's really true to what starter culture kind of is about, in that it's not about making something wrong and saying don't do that. It's saying, oh, this is where we are, like, welcome to the reality of what it is to be human right now, but we need to expand beyond that, and we can't get rid of what we've got, but by kind of helping dismantle it so that we can expand into something else that is impossible to know from this place.
Yeah, that's making me think of what I was hearing when I was out on my walk today around, composting, the process of
Mm,
composting, which is the title of this, the tagline of this podcast, right? Composting Power Over Culture from the Inside Out. I was thinking about I was listening to how composting is um, the engine, the heat that happens in the compost pile is like the engine of transformation.
mm, mm,
And that it's not that, it's in fact the very material that dies
mm,
and is composted
mm,
into, eaten by worms and mycelial filaments and all the aphids and all the creatures that are in there, as well as the heat of it,
mm,
um,
mm,
are actually transforming it into something that's nourishing and able to grow the
mm,
seeds of the future.
mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm remembering that when you named that part of the heat, the transformative energy of composting, the other thing you said, and I wrote it down because I loved it, was death is the invisible heart of renewal. And I was just like, yes. And there's something of like when you and I and other starter culture family are talking about the need to support this cultural death. It feels so natural and easy, and then it's like suddenly there's a kind of a moment of like, oh, that isn't a conversation that everyone is always engaged in. And yeah, so just recognizing how for us that is so integral, leaning into and really embracing the reality of death, not just of our immediate loved ones, which is obviously a really, really important part of living in these times and growing into an expanded consciousness, but beyond that, going into what is it to actually recognize that these times seem to be longing for us to not fight to keep them, to fight to upstand them, but actually to support them to die. And that to us does feel like quite a natural part of our conversation, but I'm also aware that that isn't a natural part of a conversation for a lot of people. And I guess part of our work is to normalize it, to kind of make that kind of something that is just rolls off our tongue.
And they are pointing to the first example of how we expand consciousness, right? It's like, let's think about death. Could we think about death in a different way? Can we invite the truth of the way it is right now, that we are in the middle of, or the beginning of a sixth mass extinction, and our own death and the death of those we love and the death of everything we know is happening, right? And that we don't like scramble and try and save what we can, but that we turn towards and help along. I mean, my prayer, really, my deepest prayer is I know that violence and destruction are part of life. Volcanoes and earthquakes are part of life, and yet, the soft-bellied human of me hopes so much that there'll be as little violence as possible in this transition, and knows, creatures in their death throes who are fighting death often do a lot of damage. So that's a little side note, I guess, but to really lovingly turn towards the death and dying as the invisible heart of renewal. That we can't have one without the other. We can't have the new life without letting the old life die. We know that from initiation practices and stories and journeys. We know that from myths. We know that from looking at cultures over time, at species and renewal of Earth over time, the way that destruction and regeneration are how the Earth evolves.
Gosh, it's just when you spoke then of, this reality of how when creatures are dying sometimes often, there is a kind of violent fight that can actually cause a lot of pain and suffering to others around them when in that dying process. I was just so kind of struck and sobered by that. Like, it's like, yeah, that's what's happening on a collective scale right now. We're kicking and screaming and turning to our addictions to absent ourselves so we don't have to kind of admit to the reality of our situation, that we are in this cultural death process. And that doesn't mean that there isn't something beyond it. It's almost like unless we allow ourselves to turn towards the reality of death, and that inevitably isn't going to be entirely smooth, and it is going to involve a degree of suffering, unless we turn towards that, then it's almost like it is impossible to be truly birthing something different. And so we're kind of blocked. It's kind of like, there's a blocking to the actual extent of what's possible, because if there's resistance to what actually is, then how can we possibly, create something different? So yeah, I'm really with that. And as is often the case in our conversations, is that for me, there's this interweave between when we're looking at this at an individual level, and we're thinking about what does this mean for me as an individual and my friends and loved ones around me, and activists and change makers at an individual level, and that in itself is quite confronting, to be like, how do I dismantle, like how this culture is showing up in me? Because if we're going to dismantle power over culture, then I have to start with what's going on in me and how I'm living. And how do we do that in our groups and in our organizations and in our movements? Because that to me feels like I know from, I suppose, living it through starter culture, it's this realization of how ingrained actually this power over culture is within our organizations, and how so much we perceive that their future depends on a perpetuation of elements of that power over culture. And in our conversations, often there's a kind of like process where there's a part of me hanging on to like, no, but we have to keep that bit. Like, I couldn't possibly kind of go and do that in organizations because that's just too much or something. And then you're always very skillfully kind of like, maybe it might be power over culture showing up in you, Claire.
With so much love.
With so much love, and gratefully received. And it's just such a rich dance to kind of be like, do you know what? Our groups and our organizations and our movements also need to support power over culture in them to die. And that's a scary process, because most of us are entangled in financial realities that it feels like if we are to truly honor that, then that kind of lifeline will be cut. That if we were to say to our funder, for example, that, oh, actually, we need to entirely reinvent ourselves, we need to take a year off and do something completely different, or whatever it is that it looks like. I'm just making this up, but we believe and we project that we would lose our funding, or whatever your version of that is, if you're in a group or an organization. It's like, if I change radically how I'm doing what I'm doing, and then nobody will come to my programs. If I really step into my truth that is outside of power, beyond power over culture, then it will be too radical and nobody will come, or whatever your version is. It's like, oh no, but that's exactly what needs to change. Because again, just as much as unless we dismantle power over in ourselves as individuals, unless we dismantle it in the collective, in our groups and movements and organizations, then we are just part of perpetuating it.
Right. That's great. There's a couple things here that are just really delicious. The first is I'm really getting kind of a lived, embodied feeling of what we mean by inner-led change from what you're just saying. That it's inner-led to dismantle the power over culture, that we need to start with it in ourselves. And within our organizations, like that we don't look over there, right? But that we look within first. And and I'm feeling the rub of like, oh, right. And there's just something in there also about privilege and oppression and white supremacy, and this piece around, there's one way of doing this work where we're looking at it and separating ourselves from it and making like judgments about the modern paradigm or the power over culture. And there's a way of kind of therefore keeping ourselves safe from it and distancing from it, judging it, because of course it's wrong, but there's something also about, and there's this kind of insidious privilege in there in terms of how do I want to say this? The kind of the cult of the individual, right? Like one of the markers of power over culture is the cult of the individual.
that I can have my own little house and my own little world and my own little vacations and my own little dreams, and I can kind of ignore everybody else. And I have the capacity to do that. I can have my own swimming pool. I don't have to go to the public swimming pool, whatever. And so it's like, are we willing to be messy and dirty and with each other, and include ourselves in like, oh, here's how I'm complicit, not in a shaming way. As we know, shame is a tool of the power over culture, of the consciousness that's gotten us into this situation, but as an inclusionary way to return from separation. We are neither separating ourselves as victims of something, and nor as perpetrators, but to see, how are we all part of the warp and weft? And boy, is that difficult. How do we change consciousness within the consciousness? Because everything is soaked in this consciousness that it's the power over culture. Like, I was thinking about that too. It's like, you can't really point to anything that's human made that's outside of the consciousness of power over culture. And I think that's why what's so radical about starter culture also is that we point to the other than human, because the other than human, the wild ones, the herons and the egrets and the cranes that are flying overhead outside of my window, they are carrying and embodying a consciousness that is other than the power over culture, right? It's they're beholden to the biology and the warp and weft of earth community and earth consciousness. And that, for me, is one of the most important and beautiful pieces about starter culture, is that our commitment is to center other than human, center mystery, center earth's dreaming, not a human's dreaming, even as beautiful as our human dreams are. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, gosh, there's so much in what you've just said. It's like, for me, that last piece you've just finished on, it's like, there's something of that kind of real humility that goes with this journey of recognizing that kind of integral to power over culture is this belief that we can predict and control, and that turning towards and expanding into more than human consciousness and our allyship and with the whole earth community. It's like therein lies the way forward, and it can't exist without it, because it is a reality. It's almost like it's the choiceless choice. It's like, oh, okay, unless we lean into this and expand into this reality, it's not going to work, and the same goes for when we're thinking of all of the polarity within the human dimension, and the oppression and the marginalization and the inequality and injustice. It's like, that's not, turning towards that and learning how to collaborate across difference. That's not kind of an optional extra. It's integral. It's like, it is an integral part of life happening. It's like, there's no contesting it. It is life. It exists, and it is the beauty of the expansive love that we all live as, And so, so absolutely. And for me, I kind of feel like there's a double edge within the funding kind of piece that we're working a lot with around, really dedicating ourselves to finding ways to make more funding available for inner-led change, partly or largely because we recognize that it really, really sucks and is not okay for us, that to be able to get support around the work that we're talking about is a privilege. And that unless in the world, the market economy that we sadly live in currently, unless you can afford it, it's unlikely that you're going to get the support needed for a lot of what we're speaking of, and we don't want that to be the reality. We're really committed to doing everything we can to transform that. Right. And, there's a reality that so much of what gets understood to be inner work actually is born of the same consciousness that has created those inequalities and power over culture. And so a lot of what you were speaking in that kind of that need to splash around in this mess together and not kind of feed the separation with some of us are broken and some aren't, and and shaming each other for not getting it right in the ways that we communicate. It's like, really landing into the kind of, as Bayo Akomalefe would say, it's like, the trauma is the collective waters that we're currently swimming in, and we can't kind of it's just not true to kind of imply that there are those that are broken and need fixing and some of us don't, and poor you. It's like, no, we're all there, and if it's not awakened you yet, that's because it's not awake in you yet. You know, it's like trauma lives in all of us. It has to, because we share the same collective histories, you know. And, you know, if we each of us track ourselves back, our lineages are going to be a mix of oppression and oppressing. And so that lives in us. And yeah, so there's something in this that feels so important to kind of just really recognize the complexity of power and privilege within this, as we keep kind of presencing within the kind of the creative tension of leaning into birthing into a consciousness beyond that which we are birthing it from.
Right. I just want to make space for that for just a moment here, because that was, yeah. Yeah, how do you talk about everything all at once? and both say yes to it, you know? How to live fully alive, and how to die beautifully, and how to offer our gifts and do the justice and equality work, and you know, be active in terms of living a diverse and
really big. And there's something of this reality of, you know, through one lens, the conversation that we're having right now and everything we're pointing to is such a privilege, you know, to kind of have the time and the space and the resources to be dedicating ourselves to this conversation is such a privilege. And there's something, and so of course it's like there's always going to be the parts of us and the voices that are saying, how on earth can you be attending to this when there are people dying and there are people suffering, and you know, yeah, and it's like it's both. And I guess the point we're trying to make and what we're trying to live through starter culture is the reality that it has to be both. And that, yes, of course, the kind of firefighting actions that are in the immediacy of you know, of people in so much pain and suffering right now, those kind of more sticking plaster approaches that are kind of just trying to like alleviate the suffering right now are so essential. And we're just trying to prise open that kind of that window to say, and if that's coming from, you could say, victim, persecutor, rescuer consciousness, you know, whereby we're just trying to rescue and we're not, you know, actually inquiring into what parts of us are jumping in there, and we're not having a longer view, you know, and we're not kind of feeling into the collective well-being, and we're just attuning to something micro, then we're missing something. So, you know, it's both and more. It's like,
so here's a second way I'm hearing that starter culture is committed to and encouraging of ways of dismantling power over culture from within, is the shift of consciousness that happens, or the expansion of consciousness that happens when we hold non-binary truths, when we say yes to holding all the perspectives, whether they're all the perspectives within us, right, of all the voices of ourselves, or all the perspectives of the people at the table, or all the perspectives of the creatures. When we let go of the relative or perceived safety of a position, of a binary position of right and wrong, or knowing what's going on, and we're able to expand into both and more consciousness, right? Then there is de facto a consciousness transformation that happens, a way that modern paradigm is, or power over culture is, composted within us. And therefore our ways of being in the world are arising from that kind of a consciousness, which invites that in other people automatically, or invites them to be in reaction against it.
Beautiful. Yeah, I mean, as you're speaking that, I'm just feeling the kind of the kind of what I'd call a transmission of, like, when we are brave enough to kind of, and resourced enough to allow all of what's here to actually exist, all of the different parts, even when they can feel like they're in competition with each other or contrast to each other. It's like just that process of allowing the wholeness of life to exist is expanding into a consciousness beyond power over, because we're no longer trying to control it and have it from that position of perceived safety that is ours. And I kind of see it a lot actually in various different group contexts, where when difference arises, how often, you know, conflict can come in and it can become so heated, and there's this sort of curiosity from an outside perspective of like, wow, why is this so heated? You know, this kind of, what it feels like so much is at stake, because there's some different perspectives showing up, and just realizing how much that kind of experience of different perspectives and different needs can tap into the parts of us that believe that that means I don't belong, and that means I'm going to get exiled. And it's this kind of either or scarcity consciousness is part of power over culture. It's both part of and a result of power over culture that kind of creates this kind of mainly unconscious terror that, you know, that it's me or you. We can't both exist, you know, and that, again, like you just so beautifully spoke, it's like in this kind of allowing our state of being to play host to the kind of the infinite multitude of parts and voices and realities, that in itself is beyond power over culture. And it sounds simple, but actually, you know, it can be a grueling process that can take time to really allow. It's like we're trying to rework an atrophied muscle, you know, that kind of atrophied muscle that is conditioned to either or, as opposed to just being a vessel to allow what's happening to arise within us.
Yeah, I'm thinking of like an ecosystem. You know, an ecosystem is everybody's all participating all at the same time. And they're all in their eco niche. They're all in their capacity of giving and receiving. They're all in their capacity of being with another. And of course, there are times of, you know, one species might swell, you know, and there would be a more devastating effect on the ecosystem. But there's that checks and balances, right? There's then the dieback, or there's stress on the entire system, and the whole ecosystem responds. Maybe each part of the ecosystem is responding differently, and how that's such an exquisite, for me right now, just really feeling the lived metaphor of that, both inner and outer, of the truth of that capacity of us to imaginally. Gosh, you know, imagination and the imaginal is such an important, is also one of the really powerful. This seems to be my job in the podcast today, is to be like, oh, look, there's another, there's another thing that starter culture is offering, is practice, and talk about atrophied muscles, you know, practice of the imaginal.
Yeah.
That we invite the imaginal capacity, not as escapism, right? But as ways of listening with the heart to the other than human voices, or ways of imagining what our minds don't think is possible, but that our hearts, as you mentioned earlier, you know, do. There's some way of the imagination being a bridge builder, or a world shifter, shaper, traveler, and what an essential ingredient.
Yeah, and as you
expansion of consciousness.
Yeah, and as you speak that, it's like just reminds me of how, you know, this kind of term imagination. It feels like it's, you know, it's kind of a mysterious word in itself, and you know, for us, it's not about the strategic mind. It's not about kind of, you know, imagining with the strategic mind. Right. It's the art and skill of emptying out, so that we can receive from the more than human consciousness, so that
Yeah.
we are a vessel for the whole and how it's dreaming, you know, the future into being. And that's a very different thing to kind of imagining in a way that's like, oh, I'm just going to imagine the future I would like. And that, you know, that, which is, you know, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's a much narrower realm of, you know, it opens a much narrower and a realm of possibility, and it's very unlikely that it's going to go beyond the power culture consciousness and culture. Whereas, you know, when we do the work, which is what, you know, what starter culture is about, this expansion of consciousness, when we do the work, that we are genuinely able to empty out, not an idea of emptying out, but a really genuine emptying out, that we can be the space in which life is emerging, then something else comes through, and then deep imagination reveals itself to us, and we're taken by utter surprise. And, you know, it's a left field kind of response. And so, yeah, something of, you know, that, like you say, that being integral to what starter culture is about. And that to be able to do that, we really need to, talking about atrophied muscles, we need to lean into these other windows and ways of knowing, you know, so that it's not just the strategic mind. And, you know, this is massive for both of us. I know it's like, it's a, you know, we're not just saying other people need to do this. It's been huge work for us because we both have very sharp strategic mind. But yeah, what is it to like lean into, you know, the felt sense of the body, and what moves through the body, and what moves through the heart as feelings, and what moves through the wider whole as the deep imagination. So it's like, without all of those kind of faculties of being, then ironically the emptying out can't happen.
Gorgeous. I want to pick up this word emptying out, because you've said it a few times in the last moments, and I want to unpack that a little bit, because that feels important to say here. I mean, several things, and please correct me or add to what I say, but that it's not about getting rid of a part of ourselves, right? I mean, I know you know this, but I'm that it's not about, emptying out is not about getting rid of parts of ourselves, or suppressing or denying or throwing out or any of those things. It's a more of a well, I would say two things, right? And again, add if what I've missed. One is our capacity to disidentify or identify with the largest, most expansive part of ourselves, the most compassionate, curious, big, loving part of ourselves, and disidentify with the parts of ourselves that are in the wounding or the protective strategies, right? For me, that's one aspect of the emptying out, is like, can I expand into the biggest stretches of me, which of course doesn't really ever end. It just kind of moves into ecosystem. But that place, that, you know, can I expand to that place where I become ecosystem, is how I think of it. And the other thing is, can I integrate, love, welcome home the previously exiled or suppressed parts of myself, to acknowledge ways that I'm conditioned and part of the power over culture, ways of trauma and wounding, you know, all the parts that are the ones that tend to react with power over culture habits or strategies, or yeah, that's enough. And choose to align ourselves with more mythic, more other than human, more resourced parts of ourselves.
Yeah, beautiful. I love that you've initiated a kind of unpacking of this term, and there's probably a billion terms that we could do this for, kind of quite helpfully. But yeah, just to kind of embellish on that, I guess, or riff off that. Yeah, absolutely, everything you've said, and I guess the layer that I would then bring in, it's almost like what you're naming to me kind of is almost, it's that kind of it's rebuilding that muscle to be the witness, and it's not enough to have an idea of the witness and watch. It's like we actually need to viscerally experience those parts and, you know, and be embodied in those parts. And the more we're on that journey, the more we see. And because, you know, there can be this idea that the more we're on the journey, the less will show up because we've kind of transformed more. But it's like, no, the more we're on the journey, the more shows up. And usually
I so wish that were former were true.
It's like, yeah, no, it just gets kind of harder and harder to kind of digest because they're more and more exiled for good reason, those parts. So yes, to kind of what I would call almost that kind of observer witness place of that, you know, the kind of wild allyship to kind of these parts that we've marginalized, that our culture, our power over culture has conditioned us to marginalize, and the kind of welcoming them back home. And then for me, the other layer of emptying out, which feels like it's almost like it goes hand in hand in a way with what's necessary, is this kind of embodied kind of visceral experiencing ourselves as the space within which everything is arising, you know, and by everything I mean everything. And so it's not, again, there's the concept of that, and I know that within a lot of kind of esoteric traditions that, you know, that is the mantra. And yet it's a very different thing to actually viscerally in our being almost skin shed these layers that kind of make me feel like just the individual self, so that there is a visceral melting in a way and skin shedding that then allows me to experience myself in as the ecosystem you speak of, you know, that as Indra's net, you know, that really is the whole in which these different parts and voices and ideas are arising, so that there's not an identification with this kind of this shape of a being, and then we've become a vessel through which, you know, something surprising from the deep imagination can visit us and gift us, with the humility to know that by virtue of living in this fleshy human dimension, I have an ego, and I'm not going to ever get rid of that. So
and shouldn't.
No, that's not the aim. But there's something of remembering that, you know, this emptying out process isn't about becoming fully enlightened. It's, you know, because as long as I'm here in this dimension, then I'm not enlightened. And I have an ego that's going to color and filter kind of what arises through that deep imagination, which, you know, again, so both and.
Yeah, both and a body, you know, and this kind of this earth being that we are, you know, that again, it's not all just conceptual head, but there's this squishy human animal body that we are in this earthy way. And also the reality of the earthly body, the shape, the color, the size, the ability, the, you know, all of these ways of making difference bad or wrong, in that power over culture does and reifies and makes, is, you know, this, it's not about saying like, all you have to do is empty out and then everything's fine, you know. It's like, and there's no such thing as racism, and there's no such thing, you know. It's like, no. Again, it's both and, you know. How do we hold the knowing that the experience of being in the body you're in has a huge makes a huge difference for how you are in the human world and the power over culture that we're in. And again, to circle back, you know, that's where it's about not the individual. That's where inner-led change of the individual meets the collective. That part of the work of inner-led change is to own one's power and privilege, or be in relationship with the way one is, and with power and privilege, if that's one's experience. Although we all have power and privilege in some sphere and some way of being. If we have experiences of marginalization, you know, all the ways that we are in this human experience is also something that needs to be both metabolized as an individual, but also actively shifted and changed, just like you were saying, in the collective.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Again, I feel like what you're bringing there kind of, really brings me into sort of sobering moment of it's, for me, there's this kind of dual kind of reality of the exhilaration of the possibility of transformation, and what it is to lean into everything we're speaking of, and how exhilarating that that transformation is, and the reality that a precursor to the actual exhilaration of transformation often is a humbling, painful process that is leaning into the reality of what it is to be in this fleshy body, whatever in our particular existence is the kind of the challenge, that we've been here, born into this lifetime to alchemize, just really recognizing that our wounds are our greatest gifts if we are able, and we're lucky enough to be given the support to alchemize them. And as you speak of the body and the reality of the body, it's like, as it's like, for me, I have lived for 25 years with a chronic health condition. That means that living in this body isn't that easy for me, and a lot of the time I'm in a lot of pain and difficulty, and so I want to include that as a kind of like I suppose just to include that we both, you and I both, have our own versions of kind of what it is to really struggle, and to know that everything we're speaking of comes with great challenge, and that life is a balance in that way. And body as portal is what really is a helpful reminder to me that what is happening is a portal to the transformation and the never-ending spiral, and that being able to embrace the difficulty that can often precede death is part of life.
Way. Yeah. And so that's, of course, reminding me of one of our other threads is how we talk about, and we're probably coming to the end of our time here, so I don't know how deep we want to go into this, but just recognizing also this thread of wound and trauma, and that we hold this a little bit differently than lots of folks, and that there's this kind of, just like you were saying, as portal, and that the gift is laid in the same crucible as the wounding, and so that we're not proponents of woundology, at the same time that we're also not ignoring the suffering that's very real. There's healing to be done, trauma work to be done in the healing level, and there's alchemizing that is beyond healing of the wound, that becomes a sacred path of one's deepest and greatest gifts that one's here to give.
Yeah, I feel it's almost inevitable that we will have a session exploring kind of core to sacred wound, alchemizing. And I wonder, before we do kind of draw to a close, do you want to just say a little bit about what you mean by woundology? Because I'm just aware it might be a term that some people lots of people might not be familiar with.
Yeah, sure. So the way I understand it is, there can be a way that we are so identified with the wound or wounding that we've experienced that it becomes kind of the central focus around which we revolve. And it becomes almost a religion, a ritual practice of devotion, or one way that I talk about it is the tyranny of the trauma, the way that it tyrannizes our lives and kind of is a unidirectional gravitational surface, it kind of like pulls all of our energy into its grasp, so that we are stuck revolving around it. And while there's wisdom in and healing within wound work that's necessary, we want to liberate ourselves from that gravitational pull that can keep us spinning in a cycle of reiterating or regurgitating the wounding of the modern paradigm in the victim, perpetrator, rescuer triangle, and cycling around and around through those roles.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, hearing you and the way you're explaining it, it's reminding me that, one key piece there is that, this culture of woundology, it's like it shines the light on the paradox of trauma, in that, trauma does have this kind of function inherently within it, that when trauma shows up in our system, it makes us become fixated on it, and it's part of its nature. And yet expanding consciousness and transforming trauma, or we could call it awakening, or we could call it liberation or co-liberation. It's like the paradox is, can we wake up in that moment and not get fixated, even though the very nature of trauma and suffering is to get fixated, and at a very neurobiological level. And so it's like, it's that kind of impossible mission that is the transformation, and is not just a kind of waking up at the individual level, but actually is the key to co-liberation beyond the paradigm we're living in, that makes that kind of paradox of consciousness a reality. It's like, so I mean, gosh, we're diving deep right here at the end, and watch the space. This is a much bigger conversation, the paradox of trauma and karmic imprints. It's like, we'll get stuck into that another time, give it more space. Yeah.
Well, I think all the threads we've been weaving have been quite meaty. I think we could dive into each one of them. And I'm really grateful that we've touched on these, because they're such essential threads in starter culture's fabric of how we go about doing what we're doing, which is supporting expansion of consciousness beyond the power over culture, or composting power over culture, igniting that heat and that fire of transformation. And centering the other than human, shifting consciousness also into the expansion of the other than human and the ecosystem. So all of these elements that we've been speaking of are so, for me, are so essential in the fabric of the core of what we're up to.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of feels like, by way of bringing this to a close, it's kind of, in terms of what we're hoping for this podcast, it's like, and for starter culture more generally, it's like, we're really wanting to create an experience that really goes beyond just being a talking shop. We don't want to kind of just, for you to just come in and listen to us kind of ramble on, even though to some extent that's what this introductory one is. But we're definitely paving the way for something that's far more experiential, and that really centers, a kind of a more than human ritual approach to the expansion of consciousness that we're speaking of, that we see as a really key kind of tool that we all need in our tool belts, whether it's for that sort of transformation, dismantling of power over culture within ourselves as individuals and change makers, and that we bring back to our groups and our organizations as inspiration, kind of to how can we transform at a collective level as well as within me, and and how can I in my group and in my collective kind of take these tools back and kind of inspire and infuse. So there's something of us constantly pulsing in and out of this kind of the dismantling of power over culture at the individual level and at the group level and the organizational and movement and cultural level, and really expanding into more than human consciousness, so that we're not kind of limiting the possibilities and the support and the web of support to the human and to the individual. It's like, it's so much bigger. So that's our hope. We have no idea how we're going to do it, but that's part of our kind of approach is really working with emergence, and as we say, emptying out to be able to see what life wants to move through us and offer. Beautifully said.
Yeah, really beautifully said. Thank you. Offering the experience, the experiential practice of expansion of consciousness. That's what we are aiming for with this podcast. And when we do speak, have more talky kinds of podcasts, that the speaking hopefully is coming from a place in us that's not so it's more imaginal and less structured in the modern paradigm, less strategic. And is a kind of earthquake, a cracking of the walls of the house of modernity. So that we can get out and go outside into the wild world. Get out of the house.
Brilliant. I love it. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, my heart is welling up with gratitude for just for you, Sarah, for the conversation and kind of, I guess, the love that births in my life and my heart, and that it allows me an opportunity to grow and expand and have these kind of expansive conversations that I become more than me. And when I started the conversation as and an extension of that would be, what gratitude for the kind of the challenge that has led to me being in a position that I'm hopefully able to offer some kind of words and gifts in the world that can be of support to others. And so giving gratitude to my challenges and to the difficulty that kind of makes room for the earthquake of transformation.
I'm so grateful to you for giving me a place as a death doula for the great dying to do my work. And the image that I received when I was listening in was, I'm grateful for the molehills out on the meadow, and that in each molehill today, this dark, black, loamy, sandy earth, in each one was a little snail shell, a little mini snail shell. And I just had that image of like, there's something coming up from the depths, and this gift of the little spiral life within, like a seed.
Very slow life.
Very slow life.
In its cocoon. Beautiful.
Thank you, my dear.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to everyone who's listening out there. We hope that this has somehow landed on fertile soil, and that we'd love to hear any feedback you want to share, and that you'll join us again.
Thank you so much for you, dear Claire, and thank you so much for listening, all of you.
Thanks for showing up today and listening in while we grappled with big concepts that weave into the heart of starter culture, and also how they touch our very human heart and vulnerable ways of being in the world. We hope you've been inspired and nourished, and that you'll take on and carry forward whatever it is that has touched you into your communities and home places. For some ideas about how you might do that, visit our website at www.starterculture.net and sign up for our newsletter. You'll get invitations for wanders out in the wildish world, information about our events, webinars, and storytelling evenings, blogs and articles, and in future, information about our online and in-person programs. Go ahead, spread the co-evolutionary love, and like, comment, and share this podcast wherever you listen. See you next time at Co-Evolutionary Culturing, composting power over culture from the inside